the lost episode of Peppa Pig that never aired. On a rainy evening, Peppa Pig's family gathered in the living room. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper, Mummy Pig was knitting, and Peppa and George were playing with their toys on the carpet. Rain drummed against the windows, creating a monotonous rhythm that gradually made everyone drowsy. Suddenly, the lights went out throughout the house. Daddy Pig got up from his chair and headed to the electrical panel in the basement. Peppa, always curious, decided to follow him despite Mummy Pig's protests. George, as usual, trailed after his big sister. Descending the creaky wooden steps into the basement, Daddy Pig shone his flashlight ahead. Peppa and George followed behind, holding hands. The basement was cold and damp, smelling of mustiness and something else they couldn't identify. Daddy Pig found the electrical panel and began checking the fuses. Peppa, bored, started exploring the basement. In the far corner, behind old boxes and forgotten furniture, she noticed something gleaming. It was a large antique mirror in an ornate wooden frame, covered with dust and cobwebs. Peppa approached and wiped the mirror's surface with her hand. Her reflection seemed strange. In the mirror, she looked paler than usual, and her eyes appeared darker. George came over to his sister and also looked into the mirror. His reflection looked unusual too. Suddenly, a third reflection appeared in the mirror. A figure that wasn't in the basement. It was a pig girl, very similar to Peppa, but with empty black eyes and a strange smile. She stood between Peppa and George's reflections and slowly raised her hand, as if inviting them to enter. Peppa stepped back, but the mirror girl continued to smile and beckon. George, mesmerized, reached out toward the mirror. As soon as his fingers touched the cold surface, the mirror began to ripple like water. At that moment, the lights came back on in the house. Daddy Pig turned around and saw the children by the mirror. He quickly approached them and led them away from the strange object. The mirror became ordinary again, showing only their own reflections. The family went upstairs, but Peppa couldn't forget the mirror girl. That night, lying on the top bunk of their bed, she heard quiet footsteps in the basement. George on the bottom bunk was also tossing and whimpering in his sleep. The next day, Peppa went down to the basement again. The mirror stood in the same place, but now it reflected not only her. The mirror girl was there permanently, watching and waiting. Each day, the reflection became clearer, and the smile grew wider. A week later, Mummy Pig noticed that Peppa had become strange. She often stared into space, smiled for no reason, and talked to someone invisible. George had changed too. He became quieter and often stared at his reflection in any shiny surfaces. One morning, the parents couldn't find the children in their beds. They searched the entire house and finally went down to the basement. There they saw Peppa and George standing in front of the mirror with empty eyes and strange smiles. 4 figures were reflected in the mirror: Peppa, George, and 2 mirror copies. But when Daddy and Mummy Pig came closer, they realized the horrible truth. The real Peppa and George were in the mirror, and those standing in front of it were the mirror copies. The mirror children turned to their parents and spoke in Peppa and George's voices, but the words echoed as if coming from far away. They said that now they would live in this world, and the real children would remain in the mirror reflection forever. Since then, mirror copies of the children have lived in the Pig family house. They look exactly the same, behave almost the same, but sometimes their eyes become empty and their smiles too wide. And in the basement, in the old mirror, the real Peppa and George still knock on the glass, trying to return home. The lost episode of Peppa Pig that never aired. The Pig family was getting ready for bed in their house on the hill. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in the living room, while Mummy Pig was tidying up in the kitchen. Peppa and George went up to their room where the bunk bed stood. George climbed onto the bottom bunk, and Peppa went up to the top. When everyone went to sleep, the house fell into silence. But in the middle of the night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound. It was a quiet scratching coming from within the walls. She listened more carefully. The sound was getting louder and clearer, as if something was trying to gnaw its way from inside the house. Peppa climbed down from the top bunk and approached the window. Outside was pitch darkness, but she noticed that all the houses around looked abandoned. The neighbors' windows were broken, and their gardens were overgrown with thorny weeds. This was strange, because just yesterday everything looked normal. Suddenly the scratching stopped, and the house filled with ominous silence. Peppa turned to George's bed, but he wasn't there. The blanket lay neatly folded, as if no one had ever slept in this bed. Peppa called for her brother, but there was no answer. She left the room and headed to her parents' bedroom. The door was slightly open, and Peppa peeked inside. The bed was empty. Moreover, there weren't even traces that someone had slept here. Dust covered everything around, as if the room had been abandoned for many years. Peppa went down to the living room. The furniture stood in its places, but everything was covered with a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Family photos on the walls had faded, and the faces in them became indistinguishable. The clock on the wall had stopped at midnight. She approached the mirror in the hallway and saw her reflection. But something was wrong. Her reflection was smiling, although Peppa herself wasn't. The reflection waved at her, then slowly disappeared, leaving the mirror empty. Peppa ran outside, but even greater horror awaited her there. The whole world around was gray and lifeless. Trees stood bare, the sky was covered with heavy clouds, and the air smelled of decay. She ran along the familiar road, but her friends' houses were also abandoned. When Peppa reached the school, she saw that the building was destroyed. The roof had collapsed, walls were covered with cracks, and only dead plants grew in the yard. She went inside and saw her classroom. On the blackboard was written in chalk, "Peppa, you were always alone." Peppa woke up in her bed, covered in cold sweat. She looked down and saw George sleeping peacefully on the bottom bunk. From the kitchen came the sounds of breakfast being prepared by Mummy Pig. Everything was as usual, but when Peppa approached the mirror, her reflection smiled at her again, even though she herself wasn't smiling.
Usually, Peppa and George used it to make funny faces and laugh at their reflections. But one day, as a thunderstorm raged outside and lightning illuminated the room with bizarre flashes, Peppa noticed something strange. Her reflection in the mirror smiled. But not like she smiled, it was a wide, almost predatory smile that didn't match her own expression. Peppa blinked. The reflection returned to normal. She thought it was just a play of light and shadow caused by the storm. George, sitting on the bottom bunk and playing with his dinosaur, didn't notice anything. Peppa decided to ignore it, but a feeling of unease lingered. The next night, when everyone was asleep, Peppa woke up to a quiet, melodic chime. It came from the living room. She cautiously climbed down from the top bunk and followed the sound. The chime led her to the wardrobe. The mirror on the door flickered, as if a dim light was burning inside it, and from it came the same chime, like the tinkling of tiny bells. Peppa extended her hoof and touched the cold surface of the mirror. At that very moment, the chime intensified, and the mirror became soft, pliable, like water. Her hand passed through it. Curiosity overcame fear, and Peppa stepped forward. She found herself in her room. But something was wrong. The colors were paler, the sounds muffled, and most importantly, George wasn't here. His bunk was empty, the blanket neatly folded. From the mirror, a voice emerged, quiet but clear. It called her name. Peppa turned around. Her reflection stood in the mirror, but it was alive. It smiled that same predatory smile, and it extended its hand towards her. "Shall we play?" The reflection whispered. "It's so much fun here, always. The games never end." Peppa felt a chill run down her body. She tried to step back but couldn't. Her feet seemed rooted to the floor. The reflection stepped forward, emerging from the mirror. It was an exact copy of Peppa, but its eyes were empty and its smile was eerie. It approached her, and Peppa felt her own body become cold and still. She watched as her reflection, now real, smiled and looked at her. And she understood. She had become a reflection, trapped in this pale, silent world. Reflection. Peppa turned and walked to the mirror. It looked inside. There, in the depths, she saw her real room. And there, on the bottom bunk, sat George. He was looking at the mirror, and his reflection smiled. That same predatory smile. The next morning, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig entered Peppa and George's room. Peppa was sitting on her bunk, engrossed in playing with her toys. George was sleeping on the bottom bunk. Everything was as usual. But sometimes, when no one is looking, Peppa approaches the mirror, and her reflection smiles. That very same smile. And she knows that one day, George will also look into the looking glass, and then the games will never end. Peppa Pig, the toy that grew teeth. The attic was always dusty, and no one went up there often. But one day, Daddy Pig decided to look for an old photo album and climbed upstairs. Instead of the album, he found a box. A very old one. A cardboard box wrapped in cloth, as if someone had tried to hide it long ago. Inside was a soft toy. Not a bear, not a bunny. Something unrecognizable. Pink, with 2 buttons for eyes and a black stitched smile. Its paws were short, the face wide, slightly crooked. "Oh, what an interesting find," said Daddy Pig, returning from the attic. "Must have been from the time we moved in." "How cute," said Mummy Pig. "We can let the children have it." "Can I keep it?" asked Peppa. "I'll call her Pinky." Peppa placed the toy on her shelf. Pinky just sat there, unmoving, silent. But the room instantly felt quieter. The next morning, Peppa noticed that Pinky's smile had grown wider. The thread had tightened, and between the stitches appeared tiny white notches. "George, did she have teeth?" "No," he said, stepping back. Each day, more teeth appeared. They seemed to grow out of the fabric itself. The toy was still soft, but inside something began to stretch. It felt heavier, denser. On the 3rd night, Peppa woke up to a strange noise, a wet chewing sound, quiet but unpleasant. She looked around and saw that Pinky was no longer on the shelf. She was sitting by the bed, her head slightly tilted, as if listening. Peppa wrapped herself tightly in her blanket and shut her eyes. In the morning, no one believed the toy had moved. She was back on the shelf. "Probably just fell," said Mummy Pig. On the 4th night, Daddy Pig was the one who woke up first. He heard scratching and decided to check the house. In the hallway, thin marks lined the wall, as if something sharp had been dragged along it. The scratches led to Peppa's room. "What's this?" he asked. "Maybe someone scratched the wall with a toy," said Mummy Pig. "Or maybe George was playing at night." But George just nodded. He didn't remember anything. By the 5th day, Pinky's teeth were clearly visible, small, neat, white. They protruded from the smile like a little predator's. If you listened closely, you could hear a faint clicking, as if her jaw moved slightly. Peppa hid the toy in a closet, wrapped her in a blanket. But by morning, she was back on the shelf, smiling wider. Now she had 2 rows of teeth. "George," Peppa whispered, "I think she bites us at night. I have a mark on my hoof." On the 6th night, Pinky wasn't just sitting. She was lying by the door, as if waiting for someone to leave. In the morning, new scratches appeared on the bedroom wall. On the floor, a wool thread pulled tight as if yanked with force, and next to it, a tiny fragment of a tooth. The toy had vanished. Nowhere in the closet, not under the bed, not in the box. Only in the corner, behind the dresser, Daddy Pig found a shadow, slightly darker than the rest of the room. When he stepped closer, it faded. On the 7th night, Peppa heard something gnawing on the leg of her bed. Quick, desperate. Pinky had returned. She was no longer soft, no longer dusty. Now her smile was a solid row of teeth. Peppa Pig, the clock-eyed man. It all started quietly. No sound, no warning. One morning, Peppa looked out the window. and saw that the house across the street was no longer empty. In the window stood a figure, tall, wearing a long coat. His face was unclear, but Peppa could feel he was staring straight at her. "Mummy, who is that?" she asked. "A new neighbor," Mummy Pig smiled. "He just moved in." "He's strange," Peppa said. "His eyes, they look like clocks." Mummy didn't pay much attention, but Peppa had seen them. The neighbor didn't have normal eyes. Instead, his face held two tiny clock faces. They turned slowly, like real mechanisms, and every time he looked at her, the hands began to spin faster. All day, he stood at his window. He didn't blink. He didn't move, just watched. With each day, he grew closer. First, at the window, then by his gate, then just standing on the road right across from their house. He never walked fast, but somehow he was always closer than the day before. Peppa started keeping the curtains closed, but she still felt his gaze. The ticking of his clock eyes echoed inside her head. Quiet, rhythmic. "Daddy," she said, "I don't like our neighbor." "Nonsense," Daddy Pig waved it off. "He probably just enjoys peace and quiet." But the nights were worse. At exactly 3 a.m., Peppa would wake up. Every night. Always at 3. She'd hear a mechanical sound, a crisp, deliberate tick, like someone was winding a clock. One night, she got up and went to the window. Outside, in the yard, he stood. His clock eyes spun wildly. He didn't move, but time around him felt wrong. "George?" she whispered. "He's here again." "Who?" George muttered sleepily. "The neighbor. He's watching me." "He watches every day." The next night, every clock in the house stopped. The wall clock, the ones in Mummy and Daddy's room, even George's toy clock, all frozen. But at exactly 3 a.m., they all started ticking again, slowly, loudly. Peppa got out of bed. The door to the hall was open. On the floor, a strange mark, round and faint, like someone had stepped with a foot shaped like a clock face. She crept to the living room. The TV was off, but its dark screen reflected a light, and in the reflection, he was behind her. She turned around. Nothing, but on the glass, a smudged imprint, circular, with a faint gear pattern. On the final night, he entered the house. No doors opened, no locks clicked. But Peppa woke without knowing why, and she felt it. He was inside. She sat up in bed, holding her breath. From beyond the door came the ticking, tick, 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 each second louder, each step closer. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't speaking. He was just getting nearer. When the door creaked open, Peppa saw his eyes. 2 clock faces, no hands, just endless motion, endless measuring. "Go away," she whispered.